It was supposed to be a simple visit to the bank for Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, an 82-year-old widow who had spent her entire life following the rules. With her late husband's savings in that very institution, she had never imagined she would be treated as anything less than a valued customer. But today things were different. As she stood at the counter, clutching her worn-out handbag, the bank teller's eyes narrowed. The young employee barely looked at her before sighing in frustration. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't process this transaction without proper verification," the teller said, tapping on the desk impatiently. Mrs. Simmons' hands trembled. She had provided the same documents she always had, yet now they were suddenly insufficient. Other customers in line began whispering, their gazes shifting between her and the teller. The bank manager, a tall man in an expensive suit, stepped forward, his expression cold. "Ma'am, if you can't provide the correct paperwork, we'll have to ask you to leave," he said, his tone lacking any empathy. Humiliated and unsure of what to do, Mrs. Simmons felt a lump in her throat. Was this how people were treated now? After years of loyalty, she was being dismissed like an inconvenience. Her eyes welled up as she struggled to find the right words. Then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, the automatic glass doors slid open with a soft asterisk whoosh asterisk. The room fell silent. A familiar figure stepped inside, his presence commanding attention. The staff at the bank froze in place, their faces turning pale. Customers gasped, some even pulling out their phones in disbelief. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur himself, walked in with a calm but firm expression. He had witnessed everything, and he wasn't about to let it slide. What happened next left everyone in the bank speechless. The air inside the bank felt heavy, as if time had slowed down. Every pair of eyes was locked onto Elon Musk, who stood just inside the entrance, his expression unreadable. The employees, who had moments ago dismissed Mrs. Simmons without a second thought, now looked as if they had seen a ghost. The manager, suddenly aware of the weight of the situation, straightened his tie and forced a nervous smile. Elon didn't say anything at first. He simply walked forward, his steps calm but deliberate. His gaze swept over the scene, the trembling elderly woman, the dismissive staff, the onlookers who had done nothing. He could feel a discomfort growing in the room. People whispered in hushed voices, unsure of why he was there or what he would do next. Mrs. Simmons, still holding onto the counter for support, looked up at him with confusion. She knew who he was. Everyone did. But why was he here? And why did he seem concerned about her? The manager finally found his voice. "Mr. Musk, we weren't expecting you today." He let out a nervous chuckle, as if trying to turn the moment into something casual. Elon tilted his head slightly, his eyes studying the man. "I wasn't expecting to be here either," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I saw something just now that didn't sit right with me." The tension in the room thickened. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, waiting to see what would happen. The bank teller who had spoken so harshly to Mrs. Simmons lowered her head, her hands fidgeting with the papers on the counter. "Would you mind explaining?" Elon continued, his voice steady. "Why an elderly woman, who has been banking here longer than most of your employees have been alive, is being treated like a nuisance?" The manager opened his mouth but hesitated. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and he knew there was no easy way out of this. But Elon wasn't finished. He turned to Mrs. Simmons and asked, "Ma'am, what exactly happened here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, They said my documents weren't enough. But I've never had a problem before." Elon's jaw tightened. Something about this didn't add up, and he was about to get to the bottom of it. The silence in the bank was deafening. Everyone was waiting to see what Elon Musk would do next. The bank manager shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together as if searching for the right words. The young teller, who had dismissed Mrs. Simmons so easily before, kept her gaze lowered, avoiding eye contact. The tension was thick, but no one dared to break it. Elon turned back to Mrs. Simmons, his expression softening. "Ma'am, do you have your documents with you?" he asked gently. She nodded, her frail hands trembling slightly as she reached into her handbag. She pulled out a few papers, carefully folded and warm from years of handling. Elon took them with care, glancing over them before looking back at the staff. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, his voice calm but firm. So why exactly was she being refused service? The manager cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain composure. "Well, Mr. Musk, it's just, sometimes policies change, and we have to be thorough." Elon raised an eyebrow. Policies change, and yet, no one thought to explain that to her properly. Instead, she was treated like an inconvenience. His words carried weight, and the staff knew it. Mrs. Simmons shifted uncomfortably, feeling as though she had become the center of a much bigger issue. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she said softly. "I just wanted to access my own money." Elon smiled reassuringly. "You didn't cause any trouble, ma'am. They did." He turned his gaze back to the manager. "Is this how you treat all your senior customers? Or is there something else going on here?" The question hung in the air, and the staff visibly tensed. A few employees exchanged nervous glances, as if silently debating whether to speak up. Then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke. "She's not the only one." A middle-aged man stepped forward, his face tense with frustration. "I've been banking here for years, and recently I've noticed something strange. They've been making it harder for older customers to withdraw their money. Extra paperwork, unnecessary delays, like they're hoping we'll just give up." A murmur spread through the crowd. Other customers began nodding, their whispers growing louder. Something was definitely wrong. Elon's expression darkened slightly. He had come in expecting to deal with one case of mistreatment, but now it seemed much bigger than that. This wasn't just about Mrs. Simmons. This was a pattern. He turned back to the manager, his patience wearing thin. "I think you have some serious explaining to do," he said. The manager swallowed hard, his face pale. It was clear now. Something was being hidden, and Elon Musk was about to uncover the truth. The air inside the bank felt charged, thick with a tension that no one dared to break. The staff stood frozen, their faces etched with unease as more customers murmured among themselves. The realization that this wasn't an isolated incident was beginning to sink in. Elon Musk remained calm, but his sharp gaze never left the manager, who was now visibly sweating. "I'm waiting," Elon said, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. The manager swallowed hard. "Mr. Musk, I assure you, there's nothing dishonest happening here. It's just standard procedures." His attempt at sounding confident failed miserably. Elon tilted his head slightly. "Standard procedures? Funny how they seem to target only elderly customers." He glanced at Mrs. Simmons, then at the man who had spoken up. "And I have a feeling if we ask around, we'll find more stories just like theirs." A woman near the back hesitated before raising a hand. "I've had trouble too," she admitted. "They made me come back 3 times for missing paperwork, even though I had all the documents they asked for." Another man added, "They lost my withdrawal request and said I'd have to wait a month for approval. It's my money, but they're acting like they control it." The murmurs grew louder, frustration bubbling up as more people shared similar experiences. The bank employees shifted uncomfortably, their carefully built authority crumbling under the weight of so many voices. Elon crossed his arms. "Looks like we have a pattern here." He turned back to the manager. "So tell me, what exactly is going on?" The manager opened his mouth but hesitated. His eyes darted to the side, toward an office door behind the counters. Elon caught the movement immediately. His expression sharpened. "Someone in there calling the shots?" Elon asked, nodding toward the office. The manager stiffened, but before he could respond, the door cracked open. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the scene. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp eyes scanned the room with quiet authority. The room fell silent again. The bank employees stood straighter, as if in the presence of their real boss. The customers, now emboldened, turned their attention to the newcomer. Elon met the man's gaze, unflinching. "I take it you're the one in charge." The man gave a small, practiced smile. "And you must be Elon Musk." His voice was smooth, too smooth, like someone who was used to controlling conversations. "It's an honor to have you here. Though I must say I wasn't expecting a disruption." Elon didn't blink. "And I wasn't expecting to walk into a bank that mistreats its customers. But here we are." The man's smile faltered just slightly. He stepped forward, clasping his hands together. "I can assure you, Mr. Musk, there's no mistreatment happening here. Just a few misunderstandings." Elon glanced around at the customers, their frustrated faces saying otherwise. He turned back, his voice unwavering. "Then you won't mind explaining exactly why so many people are having misunderstandings when trying to access their own money?" The man's jaw tightened, but his composure remained intact. "I'd be happy to discuss this in private, Mr. Musk." His tone was polite, but there was something behind it, something calculated. Elon smirked slightly. "I think we'll discuss it right here. Seems like your customers deserve some answers." The tension in the room reached its peak. The bank's so-called leader was cornered, but he wasn't backing down. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than anyone had realized. And now, with Elon Musk refusing to step away, the truth was about to be exposed. A thick silence filled the bank, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on everyone in the room. The man in the expensive suit kept his practiced smile, but something flickered behind his eyes. Annoyance, maybe even fear. Elon Musk had seen it before, the look of someone who was used to controlling the narrative, but had just lost their grip. "Mr. Musk," the man began smoothly, "I understand your concerns, but this is a matter of internal policy. I assure you, we take customer service very seriously." Elon let out a short breath, almost amused. "If that were true, I wouldn't be standing here right now, would I?" He gestured toward the crowd of customers still lingering, their frustrations etched across their faces. "Seems to me like your internal policy is designed to make it difficult for older customers to access their money. Why is that?" The man's smile thinned. "I assure you, there's nothing unethical happening here." His voice remained calm, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly at his side. Elon caught the movement. He had seen this type before, people who thought they were untouchable. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make sure only the man could hear. "Then you won't mind if I take a look at your records?" The man didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened slightly. "That won't be necessary." Elon tilted his head. "Why not? Something you don't want me to see?" Before the man could respond, a sudden commotion came from the back of the bank. One of the employees, a younger woman in a navy uniform, rushed forward, her face pale. She hesitated, glancing between the manager and the suited man before finally locking eyes with Elon. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're right. There is something going on here." The room shifted. Customers leaned in, sensing the shift in power. The manager shot the woman a warning glare, but she squared her shoulders and continued. "They've been stalling large withdrawals on purpose," she revealed, her words tumbling out quickly. "They say it's due to policy changes, but I've seen the emails. The orders come from higher up. They want elderly customers to give up, to leave their money in the bank longer." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Simmons clutched her handbag tighter, her lips parting in shock. Elon's expression didn't change, but something sharper flickered in his eyes. "And why would they want that?" he asked, though he already had a guess. The employee hesitated, as if afraid to say it out loud. "Because they're using those funds to make short-term investments. They delay withdrawals just long enough to generate returns before releasing the money." The bank manager's face went completely pale. The suited man's jaw clenched. The whispers in the bank turned into a dull roar as people put the pieces together. Elon took a slow breath, his patience thinning. "So you're telling me," he said, turning back to the suited man, But this bank is intentionally making it harder for seniors to access their own savings, just so you can gamble with their money. The suited man's smile was gone. His fingers twitched again, but his voice remained eerily calm. Mr. Musk, I don't think you understand how the banking industry works. Elon raised an eyebrow. No, I think I understand perfectly. For the first time, a flicker of real concern crossed the man's face. He had underestimated the situation, underestimated Elon. And now, with the entire bank watching, there was nowhere left to hide. But then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, something unexpected happened. A loud chime echoed through the bank as the security doors suddenly locked. The lights flickered for a second before returning to normal. A robotic voice came over the intercom. Security lockdown initiated. Please remain calm. A stunned silence fell over the room. The customers exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Simmons gripped Elon's arm. What's happening? She whispered. Elon's gaze snapped back to the suited man, whose expression had darkened. There was no more polite act, no more fake smiles. Looks like I underestimated you too, Elon muttered. The suited man exhaled slowly. Mr. Musk, you should have left this alone. The game had changed. The bank was now on lockdown, and Elon knew exactly what that meant. Someone was trying to make sure the truth never left this building. A heavy silence settled over the bank, the tension thick enough to cut. The customers glanced at each other nervously as the robotic voice repeated the message. Security lockdown initiated. Please remain calm. Elon's eyes stayed locked on the suited man, reading him like an open book. This wasn't just a simple policy issue anymore. This was a cover-up. And whoever was behind it wasn't planning to let the truth slip out so easily. Mrs. Simmons clutched his arm, her voice trembling. Mr. Musk, what does this mean? Are we trapped? Elon gave her a reassuring nod, but kept his focus on the man in front of him. It means someone just made a big mistake, he said, his voice low. The suited man exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back as if dropping the last bit of his carefully crafted persona. Mr. Musk, he said, you're a smart man. Surely you understand that sometimes businesses have to make tough decisions. Elon didn't blink. Tough decisions. You mean stealing from the people who trusted you with their money. His voice carried through the bank, sending a ripple of whispers through the crowd. The man let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. It's not stealing, Mr. Musk. It's strategy. We hold the money a little longer, put it to work in short-term investments, and by the time withdrawals are processed, no one notices. The customers still get their money. We just borrow it first. Elon shook his head, his expression unreadable. Except when people like Mrs. Simmons need their money, they're forced to jump through hoops. You're hoping they'll just give up. The suited man sighed as if bored by the whole conversation. You're making this sound worse than it is. It's just business, Mr. Musk. And no matter what you think, you're not leaving this bank until I say so, At that moment, a sharp beep echoed from Elon's pocket. Calmly, he pulled out his phone, glanced at the screen, and smirked. That's funny, he said, because I think your lockdown just got overridden. Elon gave her a reassuring smile. Most people care more than you think, he said. Sometimes, they just need to see that speaking up makes a difference. The young bank employee who had bravely spoken out approached, her hands still slightly trembling. I thought I was going to lose my job, she confessed. But when I saw you standing up for her, I knew I couldn't stay quiet. Elon nodded. It takes courage to do what's right, especially when the system is against you. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small card. If you ever need a job, give me a call. Her eyes widened in shock, then gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. The distant sound of police radios crackled through the air as officers loaded the bank executives into squad cars. A few reporters had already gathered, eager to uncover the full story. This wasn't just about one bank anymore. It was about something bigger, a system that had been bending rules for far too long. But today, at least, people had won. As Elon walked toward his car, he took one last glance at the bank. Change didn't happen overnight, but every fight for fairness mattered. Today had been about more than just money. It had been about trust, dignity, and standing up for what's right. With a final nod to Mrs. Simmons, he stepped into his car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving behind a bank that would never operate the same way again.